All right, you guys, that was quite the cliffhanger I left you on, and here we go, chapter 39. So we just found Edgar Allan Poe, like an original work, which that has to be worth a lot, right? And Emily just won 10% of the winnings. I guess James and Emily and Matthew. All right, here we go. So someone just said that they know how much it's worth. A voice behind them. So let's find out who it was. Chapter 39. Fog cloaked the three figures standing under the glow of the lampposts. Oh, shoot. Hand that over, Mr. Remora said, extending his hand. Barry and Clyde stood behind him. Matthew groaned. You guys again? Emily hugged the bagged manuscript. How did you find us? James asked. You didn't think you fooled me, did you? Hiding on that tour bus? I knew you must be near the end of Griswold's game or you wouldn't have showed up at my house, so desperate to get your hands on the gold bug. It was only a matter of time before you led me to this manuscript. He flexed his extended hand in a gimme motion. How do you know about it anyway? Emily asked. She scanned the park for an escape route. An iron fence enclosed the area. There was an opening to the street not too far away, but the question was whether they could outrun Mr. Remora and his goons for the second time that night. Mr. Griswold's letter says nobody knew about it. Who do you think authenticated the manuscript? Mr. Remora said. He shoved both hands deep into his pockets, pulling his jacket closed against the misty night. I've worked for that man a long time. I deduced his connection to Rufus Griswold within my first year of working for him, and he didn't find the lost Poe manuscript. I did. But there's no credit to me in that charming letter of his, is there? Of course not. We should have been partners, a 50-50 split. He never would have known what he had under his nose if it hadn't been for me. Mr. Remora paced in front of Barry and Clyde, and his hands out of his pockets now, flinging in all directions as he talked. Then Garrison planned this cock-a-me game without consulting me. You know what he said when I called him on it? Mr. Remora jabbed a finger at Matthew like he expected him to respond. Matthew shook his head and stepped back. He said, oh, but you will be a partner, Leon, and all you have to do is play the game and win. And he laughed. Emily frowned. Mr. Griswold wouldn't have been that mean. Well, he told me his idiotic plan to give the manuscript away was as a prize, and it was a honey-baked ham or plastic trophy. Like it was a honey-baked ham or plastic trophy. I was horrified. That work deserves to be in a museum, not buried in the ground like a bone, free to any dog that digs it up. Mr. Griswold agrees with you. It says so. He says so in his letter, Emily insisted. Ha! Mr. Remora barked. If he agreed with me, then it wouldn't be in your greasy hands right now. You're probably getting peanut butter all over it. It's wrapped in plastic, Matthew said. And my hands are clean, Emily added nervously. You'll cut it up for paper dolls, Mr. Remora waved his arms, the strands of his hair flopping erratically. Hey now, Uncle Leon, Barry said. Mr. Remora whipped a finger toward him. You don't get any say in this. I trusted you with entirely too much. This child has been more resourceful than you, Barry. You're worthless. You lose money that's not yours on horse races. I'm bailing you out with bookies left and right, and then I ask you to take care of one simple thing, and you screw that up too. His shrill voice rang in the night. Emily's eyes flicked from Mr. Remora to the fog-shrouded park, and in hopes of spotting something coming to see what the noise was about. Barry shifted from side to side, eyeing Mr. Remora. Claude yawned. Garrison Griswold was a fraud. He touted a deep love and respect for literature, but did you know he once used a first edition Dashiell Hammett as a coaster? A coaster! Emily took a step back, tripping on the metal box, and stumbled in the hole they dug. She fell on her bottom, the manuscript clutched to her stomach. Her sudden movement alarmed Mr. Remora, and he shouted, Don't move! The next thing Emily knew, Clyde pulled a gun out of his pocket and pointed at them. Dude, Matthew said. I thought you threw that away, Barry cried. I told you that to get you off my back, Clyde sneered. You think I want this to wash up and connect with me and Griswold's shooting? From where she sat on the ground, Emily said, You shot Mr. Griswold? All this time, she'd never questioned that it had been a random mugging in the BART station. She thought of how many times she'd refreshed the book Scavenger forums for news on how Mr. Griswold was doing, how worried she'd been that he'd never recover. And she wasn't the only one who'd been affected by such a thoughtless, violent act. The mounds of flowers and books and stuffed animals left in tribute to him around the city were proof of that. The presence of Clyde's gun should have terrified her, but it was a wave of grief swelled for Mr. Griswold's current uncertain state, followed by a tsunami of anger. You shot him over a book? How could you do that? He did nothing but positive things. He might die now, and for what? How could you be that shallow and mean? The fury rising in Emily propelled her up from the ground and forward. With every step and every word, the three men shrank back as a group, though Clyde didn't lower his gun. This isn't how it was supposed to be. Emily shouted her words into the night sky, but it didn't make a difference. Mr. Griswold's game was over. He was still in critical condition. It didn't matter if the prize had been a valuable manuscript or $1 million or a stuffed walrus. Mr. Griswold might die, and Book Scavenger might die with him. Nothing would change any of that. James and Matthew stood behind her, and Matthew placed a hand on her shoulder. Emily leveled her eyes at the three men. You are pathetic. He shot him, not me, Mr. Remora pointed to Clyde. But it had to be done. I certainly can't go publicizing that Poe's manuscript if Griswold's still around. As it stands now, nobody knows it exists. It can be my discovery. Well, Mr. Remora rumpled his hair, looking suddenly uncomfortable. Nobody knows it exists other than you three. Out of the darkness behind Clyde, a voice growled. Make that 4. There was a loud whack, and Clyde dropped to his knees. The gun flew out of Clyde's hand and skidded across the concrete. Mr. Remora dropped to a crouch, covering his head, and then peeked up, scanning the ground. There, Matthew pointed his flush poster at the gun, and James ran to retrieve it. Unfortunately, Barry did too, and got to the gun first. Clyde's attackers stepped under a lamppost, bending over Clyde to make sure he was knocked out. The dreadlocks would have been recognizable anywhere. Yeah! Hollister? Emily asked. I hope I see you kids here, but not under these circumstances, Hollister said. Emily didn't have time to dwell on all the questions Hollister's presence raised. Barry swung the gun back and forth. Don't stand there, idiot. Do something, Mr. Remora hissed. What am I supposed to do? Barry shouted. You're supposed to get me that manuscript by any means possible, Mr. Remora said. Mr. Remora jabbed a finger in Emily's direction, punctuating every word. Get me that manuscript. Hollister remained crouched next to the unconscious Clyde. He used one hand to clamp together Clyde's limp wrists while the other hand dug in his own pocket. Leon, get a hold of yourself, Hollister said. You stay out of this. Mr. Remora didn't even look Hollister's way. Hand me the gun, Barry. They're just kids, Barry said. Don't let him talk to you like that. Matthew pipped up. Barry swung the gun towards Matthew. Emily pressed the manuscript even more tightly to her chest. He's using you, man, Matthew said. He doesn't care about you. All he cares about is getting some stupid old manuscript. That is all you care about. Barry swung the gun back to Mr. Remora. Barry, Mr. Remora said in a calm, even voice, that's not true. You're my flesh and blood. Give me the gun and I'll pay you double. How much is he paying you? James asked. $500, Barry muttered. That's all? Matthew said. You know he's going to make bank on that musty old stack of papers by my sister's holding, right? He wouldn't have gone to all this trouble if it was only going to make a couple $1,000s. Don't listen to him, Mr. Remora said. He's just a kid. But what Matthew said had sunk in. You don't care about me, Barry said. All you care about are books. Faintly in the distance, Emily heard a wail of sirens. I called the police. Hollister removed his hands from his pockets to reveal a lit-up phone. They'll be here any minute. Good, Barry muttered, his gun trained on Mr. Remora. I'm sick of this gig. Oh, that's the end of chapter 39. Wow. Oh my gosh. I would love to talk about this, but it's just too much to dissect right now. So I will see you guys for chapter 40. We are almost there. Oh my God, this is so exciting. These are all such exciting chapters. I will see you guys next time. Bye.